Hey everyone, this video is going to be a little loosey-goosey, and it might not make perfect sense if you haven't already played Silent Hill 2, so you have been warned. Now, a question that popped into my head playing through the remake was, does enemy density matter from a narrative perspective? Because if you played the original game, or its very epic Xbox 360 port before playing 2024, you probably noticed that you can kill like 10 times the amount of shit this time around. And that is not remotely an exaggeration. James is really working out some issues here. But the original had a million great reasons to make combat avoidable and comparatively sparse. And you might expect one of the big ones to be that the core combat mechanics of those earlier games were probably one of their weakest aspects. Something that might sort of get forgotten with the passage of time, though, is that not only is Silent Hill 3 a lot more action-heavy than 2, even Silent Hill 1 has way more mandatory combat, which makes me think that we have to consider it a deliberate storytelling choice to make James's personal iteration of the setting less violent. And I think we're probably all on board for that. I don't think that's really going to change anyone's interpretation of that original game. But what does it mean when the story gets retold 2 decades later, and suddenly Silent Hill feels completely fucking furious? Let's do a quick rundown on how this setting functions. In about half of the games, the town works because the goofiest fucking cult that you can possibly imagine is doing goofy cult things. But we're not really going to worry about all of that. We're going to focus on the cool, misery-pilled half of the setting. Silent Hill is not some place where people get what they deserve. It's not about judgment or justice. It's a place where you punish yourself. It's about being tormented by a personal sense of guilt. And you either run from that guilt and go insane, as Eddie did, wallow in it and lose all hope, as Angela did, or you come to any one of the wacky conclusions that James might. But the constant variable is always remorse, which makes it an inherently unfair setting, where those who are the most empathetic and arguably the most deserving of mercy get it worse than anyone. Because the kinds of people who do the kinds of things that might truly deserve the worst of what Silent Hill can offer tend to lack the morality required to even make the setting function. The entire place is clearly very metaphorical, but that is the literal interpretation, and fittingly, the town torments every visitor in their own unique way. Outside of brief moments where realities seem to overlap, Eddie, Angela, Laura, and James are having completely unique experiences. Which brings me back to my initial thought. In the original game, enemies were often so spaced out and avoidable outside of specific narrative encounters that choosing to attack them and deal with the clunky combat almost felt like a deliberate role-playing decision, where James is lashing out at these things that remind him about the feelings that got him here to begin with. But the remake is a much more defensive experience, where these things are now intent on overwhelming him and you are reacting with equal brutality. And Jesus Christ, does this game feel more brutal, as James is practically forced to stomp out dozens of sexy nurses while screaming in disgust. And when Bloober Team did such a great job maintaining the spirit of the original, I guess I have a hard time interpreting this major change as strictly a gameplay decision. So there's a couple narrative ways to interpret it, but ultimately, because the town is a reflection of our own psychology, an angrier Silent Hill has to mean an angrier James. It's just a matter of where that anger is directed. It's no secret that James is disgusted with himself, with his physical urges and capacity for violence. And that's a feeling which has always been given life through Pyramid Head, who is almost entirely unchanged in the remake. So that doesn't fully address why all the other creatures are so much more aggressive. And if we're going to overanalyze the game anyway, we definitely have to look at the monster designs and what more aggression on their part might actually mean. Because, if you never noticed, every monster in the game is either sexualized in grotesque fashion or representative of James's dead wife, Mary. Or, both. Even Pyramid Head, while lacking any sexual suggestion in his appearance, exhibits behavior that is both suggestive and incredibly violent at the same time, including stabbing a woman who is a sexier, idealized version of Mary multiple times. You probably get the picture. The game is about as subtle as a brick in this particular department, and that's a big part of why it works. And let me know if you interpret this in a similar way, or if I sound especially schizophrenic today, but I feel that there's a big difference presented in James's psyche between a game where these manifestations of sexual frustration are less prevalent and more passive, as in the original, and a game where they throw themselves at him endlessly. And you know what else the remake added more of? Dark, wet holes in the wall that James has to stick his fingers into for puzzle pieces. And Bloober Team built a good amount of brand new, great puzzles for this game. They clearly know how to do it. They did not have to put more holes, they chose to. And I resent the fact that they're making me point this out. The remake isn't just angrier, it is hornier. And I think I might have an idea of why, so let's run it back. The most straightforward interpretation would be that sex isn't just eternally lingering in James's mind now, it is at the very front. And the resentment towards those thoughts in the aftermath of what he, at least subconsciously, knows that he did, is what propels him forward, what drives him to this greater level of violent revolt. And now think about the game's end goal, reach James's sick, disfigured wife, who simply can't help with his flesh and blood needs. And there's so much more psychosexual resistance to that goal now, as opposed to the original, where most of the resistance came in the form of puzzles having absolutely fucking outlandish solutions. And add to that there's also a bit more Maria now, more side activities to do with her, more conversations to be had. And that's not just because it's a longer game. Maria is the only character that you can spend notably more time with. And her company is just genuinely nice to have in a shitty, terrifying world like this. So then I'm starting to think, does this fucking game want to railroad me into the simp ending? But it actually doesn't, and I think that it's within the endings where we see how the implications of all this additional temptation and discouragement are balanced out. The game has 8 of them, and the formula for how you reach any one of these endings, the point system that the game uses, is affected by a lot of things, including some of the most insignificant gameplay behaviors that you can possibly imagine, based on the assumption that every way you could possibly react to any situation has something to say about your thoughts on James and his motives. Every tiny little detail of this game has narrative importance to the people who made it. So I was incredibly surprised at the end of my first playthrough when I got the traditionally good ending, where James shows that he did truly love Mary and he forgives himself and gets to go home. It's really nice. And I was surprised because I was literally going out of my way to get the bad simp ending. I was railroading myself and it just didn't work. I kept Maria safe, I talked to her and visited her as much as possible. I even did some of the puzzle solutions that I know work in her favor. Like, in the original game, it would have been more than enough to seal the deal and let me screw James over like the little tragedy goblin that I am. So out of curiosity, I looked into the point system breakdown for the remake's endings compared against the originals, thankfully compiled by the wonderfully autistic people over at the Silent Hill Memories website. And there are some distinct changes. The remake doesn't punish your odds at a good ending as harshly for exploring off the main track, for example. And when it comes to a couple of the game's puzzles, where you kinda need to make a vague moral judgment, the decisions that I would consider the most morally obvious now earn points towards the good ending. And there's even some gameplay changes steering you in the right direction. For example, both games have this quirk where failing to heal yourself quickly is interpreted as James not really caring whether he survives, which is one of the things that will steer you into a depressing ending. But in the remake, to go along with the huge uptick in combat, is an almost comical oversupply of healing items. Like, I had well over 30 in my inventory for a huge chunk of the game. So unlike the original, there's basically no reason to not keep yourself fully healed at all times, once again guiding you towards a happy outcome. And I feel like these little changes are the trade-off that Bloober Team decided on, because I did kind of lie to you earlier. I do think that adding way more combat to the game was initially just a gameplay decision, probably aimed at increasing the game's appeal to a general audience, and because they built a fitting, functional combat system that's actually fun to engage with, so, why not get some mileage out of it? But what's clear to me is that Bloober Team didn't take that kind of major change for granted. I think they probably sat down and absurdly overanalyzed the narrative implications in exactly the way that I'm doing right now, because this is a story that they hold dear. I mean, every game that their studio has ever put out has been a love letter to Silent Hill in some capacity. I have to imagine this was a very stressful dream come true for them. So they found a narrative solution. If there's gonna be more BDSM monsters, then the rest of the town needs to subtly reflect this increase in depravity, and James's disgust towards it all, i.e. disgust towards himself, needs to be a little more apparent. And now there has to be more genuine sexual temptation, i.e. more Maria. But if there's going to be so much working against us, then there has to be a payoff for that perseverance. And I think the payoff is the game deciding that making it through these new challenges is, in itself, evidence of James's goodness. And so you get subtly steered towards an optimistic conclusion, more so than in the original. So to my original question, does enemy density matter to a narrative? I think it does. I mean, I pray that it does, otherwise this entire video has been a bunch of short bus gibberish. But what matters when you're telling a story in an interactive medium is that you understand the kind of impact that factor has. And while the evidence doesn't exactly scream out at you, everything that I see tells me that Bloober Team understood perfectly well and took steps to keep the experience balanced. I think it would have been easy for an action-y modernization of Silent Hill 2 to completely miss the mark. In fact, I think a lot of us had pretty little faith in the Bloober Squad, and we thought they would pull punches and lack subtlety in all the wrong ways. But I am of the opinion that they proved us wrong. Anyway, that's about all I've got. I'll talk to you guys later.